So did Joe Biden cave to Republicans on the debt ceiling? Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. So in my continuing effort to try to be fair and criticize our side when I think it deserves criticism, I'm going to criticize Joe Biden today. And the thing I'm going to criticize him for in particular is his decision to negotiate with Republicans over the debt ceiling. I mean, I get the fact that Biden is worried about what would happen to the U.S. economy if the U.S. defaulted on its national debt. I get the fact that he's concerned about Social Security checks going out to seniors across the country. And I get the fact that he's worried about Medicare continuing to be able to pay its bills. But by negotiating with these Republican terrorists, all he's done is created incentive for them to hold him hostage again in the future. That's the lesson they learned back when President Obama, with Joe Biden as vice president, negotiated with them over the debt ceiling. They took that lesson and they applied it to this year. Probably the biggest outrage for me in retrospect is the fact that we didn't pass a clean debt ceiling increase back before the new Republican Congress came into office. I get the fact that it would have been tough to negotiate with Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. But guess what? They're a hell of a lot easier to negotiate with than the Republicans in charge of the U.S. House. I mean, at least these are people who care about the country in one way, shape, or form. I may disagree with them on a number of things, and I may think Kyrsten Sinema, for example, is an egotistical narcissist, but at least I think she'll acknowledge the fact that the debt ceiling needs to be raised. These Republicans, though, feel no such compunction. They are perfectly willing to throw the American economy under the bus because of the fact that it might make Joe Biden look bad. But people can say hindsight is 20/20, and unfortunately, the Biden administration's mistakes didn't end there. I mean, I have to say, I visibly cringed when I read that Janet Yellen had gone on the record saying that some of these alternative proposals for kind of working their way around the debt ceiling crisis were just gimmicks that she would not support. There's the idea, for example, of minting a $1 trillion platinum coin and depositing it with the Fed. Now, that has been shown to be totally legal, although it does seem gimmicky. But in the face of this kind of threat to our economy and this kind of recklessness, it seems to me that using a gimmick might be the lesser of the two evils. Similarly, Yellen has also warned against simply invoking the 14th Amendment to the Constitution as a way to overcome the debt limit crisis. Now, what this has to do with is a clause in the 14th Amendment that says that the debt of the United States shall not be questioned. Now, just by way of background, the 14th Amendment was one of 3 amendments that were passed in the wake of the Civil War, back when the southern states were still not really involved in the U.S. government. The 13th Amendment banned slavery. The 15th Amendment said that black people were able to vote. But the 14th Amendment, that's the big one. It includes lots of provisions. It's probably the longest amendment in our Constitution. It includes such things as, for example, the requirements that anybody born in the United States is a citizen. Now, as I ask my students, can you think of a group of people who might have been born in the United States, but who were not treated as citizens back in the 1860s? I bet you could think of a group who are like that. And that's why that provision was inserted in the 14th Amendment. Similarly, the 14th Amendment says that the Bill of Rights and the other protections in the Constitution don't just apply to the federal government, the way that the Constitution was interpreted before the Civil War, but that they apply to the states as well. That's why, for example, states cannot limit the freedom of speech of its residents, even though the amendment only says that Congress shall make no law. That's because of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment also says that all Americans are entitled to due process of law. And again, you can imagine that there was a group in the United States who were not given due process of law back in the 1860s, and the lawmakers at the time were trying to ensure that that group did have equal access to the law. So within that context, you can understand that this clause in the 14th Amendment was included so that debts that were incurred by the United States in winning the Civil War would not be undermined by future Congresses or administrations who might not have agreed with the goals of Abraham Lincoln and the Union Army. But one thing that's clear about law is the law says what the law says. And this law says that the debt of the United States shall not be questioned. Now, the reason this is actually a risky strategy, and they actually make a good point here, is that it could potentially lead to a constitutional crisis. And the problem is this, is that the Supreme Court has ruled that based upon separation of powers, the president is not able to pick and choose how he spends funds. That the president has to spend funds the way Congress has authorized it to be spent. So when the Congress authorizes the spending of funds, the president has to spend it. He can't simply withhold some of it because he doesn't think he should pay it. That's what the Supreme Court has said. So the president has to spend the funds Congress says that he spends. So Congress in their budget said, spend these funds. Now with the debt ceiling, they're saying, but don't pay them. That's all this debt ceiling is. This is not where you determine how much is going to be spent or how much is not going to be spent. This is where you determine simply whether you're going to pay the bills or not. Now, I know that Donald Trump doesn't believe in paying his bills, and it appears that this Congress, under the control of Republicans, feel the same way. But most Americans want their government to pay its bills. And so that's all the debt ceiling is will the government pay its bills? So if they don't pay its bills, then that would question the debts of the United States, thus creating a problem with the 14th Amendment. So in essence, because of these, one, ruling by the Supreme Court, and two, what the 14th Amendment says, the president has to spend what Congress authorizes and then has to pay it. So not raising the debt ceiling actually is what creates the constitutional crisis. I agree that the president is basically under an obligation to spend the money and to pay the bills then under the law. And in fact, some unions have challenged the debt ceiling as being unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. And I think they've got a hell of a case. So the point that President Biden has made is that the debt ceiling is not something to be negotiated over. The speaker tries to present it as, oh, we're negotiating over government spending. No, you're not negotiating over government spending. You're negotiating over whether the government should pay its bills. This is not the equivalent of sitting at your kitchen table deciding whether you're going to spend your money on one thing or another thing. This is tantamount to sending out checks and then calling the bank and saying, cancel those checks. How much credit do you think your creditors will give you if after you send them a check, you then stop payment on it? That's basically what the U.S. government is trying to do right now. But what's more is Republicans are not honest negotiators in this process. They claim that they're trying to control spending, but yet they also say that they want to cut taxes to the tune of more than $3 trillion. They also want to cut funds that have been directed to the IRS to collect from the very wealthy, something that they would not be in favor of if they were really in favor of controlling the budget deficit, because that will actually reduce government revenues. And finally, they've included all kinds of things in the debt ceiling that would essentially make it harder for government agencies to get anything done, while at the same time also essentially cutting the legs out from under this administration's efforts to try to address climate change, something that the Pentagon says is an existential threat to the United States. Fortunately, it appears that some Senate Democratic leaders are calling for the president to forget about these negotiations and instead resort to these gimmicks. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and the prospect of the American economy being thrown under the bus is a desperate time. These Republicans don't care about the American economy. They don't care about the budget deficit. All they care about is trying to create such a huge disaster that they can turn around and point fingers at Joe Biden in the next election and say, look at what he did to the economy, even though it was their doing from the very start. The only answer to that kind of extortion is to stand up to it. And the fact that President Biden is engaging in negotiations with these bad actors over something as critical as the debt limit, which was passed cleanly 3 times during the Trump administration, is, in my opinion, a big mistake. Well, if you want to see how President Biden had actually made a good proposal when it comes to the budget, namely increasing taxes on the rich to improve Medicare, check out this video over here. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.